Okay, welcome everyone to reading group 2 of Beelzebub Tales to His Grandson by George Gurdjieff. We are going to be reading first pages 19 through to 36, and then after that we will have a discussion about the text. Before we begin, does anyone have any questions? No. Okay. I will open up the stage. If anyone wants to volunteer to read the section, then let me know now. If not, then I'm more than happy to read it again. Okay. I will double check. Can people hear me just before I do start reading?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, that's good. Okay then. So, beginning once again with the chapter The Arousing of Thought at page 19. In the edition that I have, skipping the first 3 lines because that is naturally, organically, the end of the previous section. And we begin with Gurdjieff's story of the Trans-Caucasian Kurd. So, I shall do this without fail. Moreover, because I just now again remember the story of what happened to a Trans-Caucasian Kurd, which story I heard in my quite early youth, and which in subsequent years, whenever I recalled it in corresponding cases, engendered in me an enduring and inextinguishable impulse of tenderness. I think it will be very useful for me, and also for you, if I relate this story to you somewhat in detail. It will be useful chiefly because I have decided already to make the salt, or as contemporary pure-blooded Jewish businessmen would say, the tisms of this story, one of the basic principles of that new literary form which I intend to employ for the attainment of the aim I am now pursuing by means of this new profession of mine. This Trans-Caucasian Kurd once set out from his village on some business or other to town, and there in the market he saw in a fruiterer's shop a handsomely arranged display of all kinds of fruit. In this display he noticed one fruit, very beautiful in both colour and form, and its appearance so took his fancy, and he so longed to try it, that in spite of his having scarcely any money, he decided to buy it without fail, at least one of these gifts of great nature, and taste it. Then, with intense eagerness, and with a courage not customary to him, he entered the shop, and pointing with his horny finger to the fruit which had taken his fancy, he asked the shopkeeper its price. The shopkeeper replied that a pound of the fruit would cost 2 cents. Finding that the price was not at all high for what in his opinion was such a beautiful fruit, our Kurd decided to buy a whole pound. Having finished his business in town, he set off again on foot for home the same day, walking at sunset over the hills and dales, and willy-nilly perceiving the exterior visibility of those enchanting parts of the bosom of great nature, the common mother, and involuntarily inhaling a pure air uncontaminated by the usual exhalations of industrial towns. Our Kurd quite naturally suddenly felt a wish to gratify himself with some ordinary food also. So sitting down by the side of the road, he took from his provision bag some bread and the fruit he had bought, which had looked so good to him, and leisurely began to eat. But, horror of horrors, very soon everything inside him began to burn, but in spite of this he kept on eating. And this hapless biped creature of our planet kept on eating, thanks only to that particular human inherency which I mentioned at first, the principle of which I intended, when I decided to use it as the foundation of the new literary form I have created, to make, as it were, a guiding beacon leading me to one of my aims in view, and the sense and meaning of which, moreover, you will, I am sure, soon grasp. Of course, according to the degree of your comprehension. During the reading of any subsequent chapters of my writings, if, of course, you take the risk and read further, or it may perhaps be that even at the end of this first chapter, you will already smell something. And so, just at that moment when our Kurd was overwhelmed by all the unusual sensations proceeding within him from this strange repast on the bosom of nature, there came along the same road a fellow villager of his, one reputed by those who knew him to be very clever and experienced. And seeing that the whole face of the Kurd was aflame, that his eyes were streaming with tears, and that in spite of this, as if the intent upon the fulfilment of his most important duty, he was eating real red pepper pods, he said to him, "What are you doing, you Jericho jackass? You'll be burnt alive. Stop eating that extraordinary product, so unaccustomed for your nature." But our Kurd replied, "No, for nothing on earth will I stop. Didn't I pay my last 2 cents for them? Even if my soul departs from my body, I shall still go on eating. Whereupon our resolute Kurd, it must of course be assumed that he was such, did not stop, but continued eating the red pepper pods. After what you have just perceived, I hope there may already be rising in your mentation a corresponding mental association which should, as a result, effectuate in you, as it sometimes happens to contemporary people, that which you call, in general, understanding. And that in the present case you will understand that why I, well knowing and having many a time commiserated with this human inherency, the inevitable manifestation of which is that if anybody pays money for something, he is bound to use it to the end, was animated in the whole of my entirety with the idea, arisen in my mentation, to take every possible measure in order that you, as is said, my brother in appetite and in spirit, in the event of your proving to be already accustomed to reading books, though of all kinds, yet nevertheless only those written exclusively in the aforesaid language of the intelligentsia, having already paid money for my writings and learning only afterwards that they are not written in the usual convenient and easily read language, should not be compelled, as a consequence of the said human inerrancy, to read my writings through to the end at all costs, as our poor Transcaucasian Kurd was compelled to go on with his eating of what he had fancied, for its appearance alone, that not to be joked with noble red pepper. And so, for the purpose of avoiding any misunderstanding through this inherency, the data for which are formed in the entirety of contemporary man, thanks evidently to his frequenting of the cinema, and thanks also to his never missing an opportunity of looking into the left eye of the other sex, I wish that this commencing chapter of mine should be printed in the said manner, so that everyone can read it through without cutting the pages of the book itself. Otherwise the bookseller will, as is said, cavil, and will, without fail, again turn out to act in accordance with the basic principle of booksellers in general, formulated by them in the words, "You'll be more of a simpleton than a fisherman if you let go of the fish which has swallowed the bait," and will decline to take back a book whose pages you have cut. I have no doubt of this possibility. Indeed, I fully expect such lack of conscience on the part of the booksellers. And the data for the engendering of my certainty as to this lack of conscience on the part of these booksellers were completely formed in me, when, while I was a professional Indian fakir, I needed for the complete elucidation of a certain ultra-philosophical question also to become familiar, among other things, with the associative process for the manifestation of the automatically constructed psyche of contemporary booksellers and of their salesmen when palming off books on their buyers. Knowing all this, and having become, since the misfortune which befell me, habitually just and fastidious in the extreme, I cannot help repeating, or rather I cannot help again warning you, and even imploringly advising you, before beginning to cut the pages of this first book of mine, to read through very attentively, and even more than once, this first chapter of my writings. But in the event that, notwithstanding this warning of mine, you should nevertheless wish to become acquainted with the further contents of my expositions, then there is already nothing else left for me to do but to wish you with all my genuine soul a very, very good appetite, and that you may digest all that you read, not only for your own health, but for the health of all those near you. I said with my genuine soul, because recently living in Europe and coming in frequent contact with people who on every appropriate and inappropriate occasion are fond of taking in vain every sacred name which should belong only to a man's inner life, that is to say, with people who swear to no purpose, I being, as I have already confessed, a follower in general not only of the theoretical, as contemporary people have become, but also of the practical sayings of popular wisdom, which have become fixed by the centuries, and therefore of the saying which in the present case corresponds to what is expressed by the words, "When you are in Rome, do as Rome does," decided in order not to be out of harmony with the custom established here in Europe of swearing in ordinary conversation, and at the same time to act according to the commandment which was enunciated by the holy lips of St. Moses, not to take the holy names in vain, to make use of one of those examples of the newly baked fashionable language of the present time, namely English. And so from then on I began on necessary occasions to swear by my English soul. The point is that in this fashionable language the words soul and the bottom of your foot, also called soul, are pronounced and even written almost alike. I do not know how it is with you, who are already partly candidate for a buyer of my writings, but my peculiar nature cannot, even with a great mental desire, avoid being indignant at the fact manifested by people of contemporary civilization, that the very highest in man, particularly beloved by our common Father Creator, can really be named, and indeed very often before even having made clear to oneself what it is, can be understood to be that which is lowest and dirtiest in man. Well, enough of philologizing. Let us return to the main task of this initial chapter, destined, among other things, on the one hand to stir up the drowsy thoughts in me, as well as in the reader, and on the other to warn the reader about something. And so, I have already composed in my head the plan and sequence of the intended expositions. But what form they will take on paper, I, speaking frankly, myself do not as yet know with my consciousness. But with my subconsciousness, I already definitely feel that on the whole it will take the form of something which will be, so to say, hot, and will have an effect on the entirety of every reader, such as the red pepper pods had on the poor Transcaucasian Kurd. Now that you have become familiar with the story of our common countryman, the Transcaucasian Kurd, I already consider it my duty to make a confession, and hence before continuing this chapter, which is by way of an introduction to all my further predetermined writings, I wish to bring to the knowledge of what is called your pure waking consciousness. The fact that in the writings following this chapter of warning I shall expound my thoughts intentionally in such sequence and with such logical confrontation that the essence of certain real notions may of themselves automatically, so to say, go from this waking consciousness, which most people in their ignorance mistake for the real consciousness, but which I affirm and experimentally prove is the fictitious one, into what you call the subconscious, which ought to be, in my opinion, the real human consciousness, and there by themselves mechanically bring about that transformation which should in general proceed in the entirety of a man and give him, from his own conscious mentation, the results he ought to have, which are proper to man and not merely to single or double-brained animals. I decided to do this without fail, so that this initial chapter of mine, predetermined, as I have already said, to awaken your consciousness, should fully justify its purpose, and reaching not only your, in my opinion, as yet only fictitious consciousness, but also your real consciousness, that is to say, what you call your subconscious, might, for the first time, compel you to reflect actively. In the entirety of every man, irrespective of his heredity and education, there are formed two independent consciousnesses, which in their functioning as well as in their manifestations have almost nothing in common. One consciousness is formed from the perception of all kinds of accidental or on the part of others intentionally produced mechanical impressions, among which also be counted the consonances of various words which are indeed, as is said, empty. And the other consciousness is formed from the, so to say, already previously formed material results transmitted to him by heredity, which have become blended with the corresponding parts of the entirety of a man, as well as from the data arising from his intentional evoking of the associative confrontations of these materialized data already in him. The whole totality of the formation as well as the manifestation of this second human consciousness, which is none other than what is called the subconscious, and which is formed from the materialized results of heredity and the confrontations actualized by one's own intentions, should, in my opinion, formed by many years of my experimental elucidations during exceptionally favourable arranged conditions, predominate in the common presence of a man. As a result of this conviction of mine, which as yet doubtlessly seems to you the fruit of the fantasies of an afflicted mind, I cannot now, as you see yourself, disregard this second consciousness, and, compelled by my essence, and am obliged to construct the general exposition even of this first chapter of my writings, namely, the chapter which should be the preface for everything further, calculating that it should reach, and in the manner required for my aim, ruffle the perceptions accumulated in both these consciousnesses of yours. Continuing my expositions with this calculation, I must first of all inform your fictitious conscious that, thanks to three definite peculiar data which were crystallized in my entirety during various periods of my preparatory age, I am really unique in respect of the, so to say, muddling and befuddling of all the notions and convictions supposedly firmly fixed in the entirety of people with whom I come to contact. Tut, tut, tut. I already feel that in your false, but according to you real consciousness, there are beginning to be agitated, like blinded flies, all the chief data transmitted to you by heredity from your uncle and mother, the totality of which data, always and in everything, at least engenders in you the impulse, nevertheless extremely good, of curiosity, as in the given case, to find out as quickly as possible why I, that is to say, a novice at writing, whose name has not even once been mentioned in the newspapers, have suddenly become so unique. Never mind. I personally am very pleased with the arising of this curiosity, even though only in your false consciousness, as I already know from experience that this impulse, unworthy of man, can sometimes even pass from this consciousness into one's nature and become a worthy impulse, the impulse of the desire for knowledge, which, in its turn, assists the better perception and even the closer understanding of the essence of any object on which, as it sometimes happens, the attention of a contemporary man might be concentrated, and therefore I am even willing, with pleasure, to satisfy this curiosity which has arisen in you at the present moment. Now listen, and try to justify, and not to disappoint my expectations. This original personality of mine, already smelled out by certain definite individuals from both choirs of the judgment seat above, whence objective justice proceeds, and also here on earth by as yet a very limited number of people, is based, as I already said, on 3 secondary specific data formed in me at different times during my preparatory age. The first of these data, from the very beginning of its arising, became, as it were, the chief directing lever of my entire wholeness, and the other 2, the vivifying sources, as it were, for the feeding and the perfecting of this first datum. The arising of this first datum proceeded when I was still only, as it said, a chubby mite. My dear now deceased grandmother was then still living, and was 100 and some years old. When my grandmother, may she attain the kingdom of heaven, was dying, my mother, as was then the custom, took me to her bedside, and as I kissed her right hand, my dear now deceased grandmother placed her dying left hand on my head, and in a whisper, yet very distinctly said, "Eldest of my grandsons, listen and always remember my strict injunction to you. In life, never do as others do." Having said this, she gazed at the bridge of my nose, and evidently noticing my perplexity and my obscure understanding of what she had said, added somewhat angrily and imposingly, "Either do nothing, just go to school, or do something nobody else does." Whereupon she immediately, without hesitation, and when with a perceptible impulse of disdain for all around her, and with commendable self-cognizance, gave up her soul directly into the hands of his truthfulness, the Archangel Gabriel. I think it will be interesting and even instructive to you to know that all this made so powerful an impression on me that at the time that I suddenly became unable to endure anyone around me, and therefore, as soon as we left the room where the mortal planetary body of the cause of my arising lay, I very quietly, trying not to attract attention, stole away to the bin where during Lent the bran and potato skins for our sanitarians, that is to say, our pigs, were stored, and lay there, without food or drink, in the tempest of whirling and confused thoughts, of which, fortunately for me, I had then in my right childish brain, still fortunately for me, only a very limited number, right until the return from the cemetery of my mother, whose weeping on finding me gone, and after searching for me in vain, as it were, overwhelmed me. I then immediately emerged from the bin, and standing first of all on the edge, for some reason or other, with outstretched hand, ran to her, and clinging fast to her skirts, involuntarily began to stamp my feet, and why, I don't know, to imitate the braying of the donkey belonging to our neighbour, a bailiff. Why this produced such a strong impression on me just then, and why I almost automatically manifested so strangely, I cannot until now make out. Though during recent years, particularly on the days called Shrovetide, I pondered a good deal, trying chiefly to discover the reason for it. I then had only the logical supposition that it was perhaps only because the room in which this sacred scene occurred, which was to have a tremendous significance for the whole of my further life, was permeated through and through with the scent of a special incense brought from the monastery of Old Athos, and very popular among followers of every shade of belief of the Christian religion. Whatever it may have been, this fact still now remains a bare fact. During the days following this event, nothing particular happened in my general state, unless there might be connected with it the fact that during these days I walked more often than usual with my feet in the air, that is to say, on my hands. My first act, obviously in discordance with the manifestations of others, though truly without the participation not only of my consciousness but also of my subconsciousness, occurred on exactly the 40th day after the death of my grandmother, when all our family, our relatives, and all those by whom my dear grandmother, who was loved by everybody, had been held in esteem, gathered in the cemetery according to custom, to perform over her mortal remains, reposing in the grave, what is called the Requiem service, when suddenly, without any rhyme or reason, instead of observing what was conventional among people of all degrees of tangible and intangible morality, and of all material positions. That's to say, instead of standing quietly, as if overwhelmed, with an expression of grief on one's face, and even if possible with tears in one's eyes, I started skipping around the grave, as if dancing, and sang, "Let her with the saints repose, now that she's turned up her toes. Oi, oi, oi. Let her with the saints repose, now that she's turned up her toes," and so on and so forth. And just from this it began that in my entirety something arose which in respect of any kind of, so to say, aping, that is to say, imitating the ordinary atomized manifestations of those around me, always and in everything engendered that I should now call an irresistible urge to do things not as others do them. At that age I committed acts such as the following. If, for example, when learning to catch a ball with the right hand, my brother, sisters, and the neighbours' children who came to play with us threw the ball in the air, I, with the same aim in view, would first bounce the ball hard on the ground, and only when it rebounded would I, first doing a somersault, catch it, and then only with the thumb and middle finger of the left hand. Or if all the other children slid down the hill head first, I tried to do it, and moreover each time better and better, as the children then called it backside first. Or if we children were given various kinds of what are called... Orc, could you mute your microphone? Or if we children were given various kinds of what are called Aberranian pastries, then all the other children, before putting them in their mouths, was first of all lick them, evidently to try their taste and protect the pleasure. But I would first sniff one on all sides, perhaps even put it to my ear and listen intently, and then, though only almost unconsciously, yet nevertheless seriously muttering to myself, "So and so and so you must, do not eat until you bust," and rhythmically humming correspondingly, I would only take one bite, and without savouring it, would swallow it, and so on and so forth. The first event during which there arose in me one of the two mentioned data which became the vivifying sources for the feeding and perfecting of the injunction of my deceased grandmother occurred just at that age when I changed from a chubby mite into what is called a young rascal, and had already begun to be, as is sometimes said, a candidate for a young man of pleasing appearance and dubious content. And this event occurred under the following circumstances, which were perhaps even specially combined by fate itself. With a number of young rascals like myself, I was once laying snares for pigeons on the roof of a neighbour's house, when suddenly one of the boys, who was standing over me and watching me closely, said, "I think the noose of the horsehair ought to be so arranged that the pigeon's big toe never gets caught in it. Because, as our zoology teacher recently explained to us, during movement it's just in that toe that the pigeon's reserve strength is concentrated, and therefore if this big toe gets caught in the noose, the pigeon might of course easily break it." Another boy, leaning just opposite me, from whose mouth, by the way, whenever he spoke, saliva always splashed abundantly in all directions, snapped at this remark of the first boy and delivered himself with a copious quantity of saliva of the following words: "Shut your trap, you hopeless mongrel, offshoot of the Hottentots. What an abortion you are, just like your teacher. Suppose it is true that the greatest physical force of the pigeon is concentrated in that big toe, then all the more what we've got to do is to see that that toe will be caught in the noose. Only then will there be any sense to our aim, that is to say, for catching these unfortunate pigeon creatures, in that brain particularity proper to all possessors of that soft and slippery something which consists in this, that when, thanks to our other actions from which its insignificance manifestably depends, there arises a periodic requisite law conformable, what is called change of presence, when this small, so to say, law-conformable confusion, which should proceed for the animation of other acts in its general functioning, immediately enables the centre of gravity of the whole functioning, in which that slippery something plays a very small part, to pass temporarily from its usual place to another place, owing to which there often obtains in the whole of this general functioning unexpected results, ridiculous to the point of absurdity." He discharged the last words with such a shower of saliva that it was as if my face were exposed to the action of an atomizer, not of an ersatz production, invented by the Germans for dyeing material with aniline dyes. This was more than I could endure, and without changing my squatting position, I flung myself at him, and my head, hitting him with full force in the pit of his stomach, immediately laid him out, and made him, as is said, lose consciousness. I do not know, and do not wish to know, in what spirit the result will be formed in your mentation of the information about the extraordinary coincidence, in my opinion, of life circumstances, which I now intend to describe here. Though for my mentation this coincidence was excellent material for the assurance of the possibility of the fact that this event described by me, which occurred in my roof, proceeded not simply accidentally, but was intentionally created by certain extraneous forces. The point is that this dexterity was thoroughly taught me only a few days before this event by a Greek priest from Turkey who, persecuted by the Turks for his political convictions, had been compelled to flee from there, and having arrived in our town, had been hired by my parents as a teacher for me of modern Greek language. I do not know on which data he based his political convictions and ideas, but I very well remember that in all the conversations of this Greek priest, even while explaining to me the difference between the words of exclamation in ancient and in modern Greek, there are indeed always very clearly discernible his dreams of getting as soon as possible to the island of Crete, and there manifesting himself as befits a true patriot. Well then, on beholding the effect of my skill, I was, I must confess, extremely frightened, because, knowing nothing of any such reaction from a blow in that place, I quite thought I had killed him. At the thought I was experiencing this fear, another boy, the cousin of him who had become the first victim of my, so to say, skill in self-defence, seeing this, without a moment's pause and obviously overcome with a feeling called consanguinity, immediately leaped at me and with a full swing struck me in the face with his fist. From this blow, I said, saw stars, and at the same time with my mouth became full as it had been stuffed with the food necessary for the artificial fattening of 1,000 chickens. After a little time, when both these strange sensations had calmed down within me, I then actually discovered that some foreign substance was in my mouth, and when I pulled it out with my fingers, it turned out to be nothing less than a tooth of large dimensions and strange form. Seeing me staring at this extraordinary tooth, all the boys swarmed round me and also began to stare at it with great curiosity and in a strange silence. By this time, the boy who had been laid out flat recovered, and, picking himself up, also began to stare at my tooth with the other boys, as if nothing had happened to him. This strange tooth had 7 shoots, and at the end of each of them stood out in relief a drop of blood, and through each separate drop there shone clearly and definitely one of the 7 aspects of the manifestation of the white ray. After this silence, unusual for us young rascals, the usual hubbub broke out again, and in this hubbub it was decided to go immediately to the barber, a specialist in extracting teeth, and to ask him just why this tooth was like that. So we all climbed down from the roof and went off to the barber's, and I, as the hero of the day, stalked at the head of them all. The barber, after a casual glance, said it was simply a wisdom tooth, and that all of the male sex have one like it, who until they first exclaim Papa and Mama are fed on milk exclusively from their own mother, and who on first sight are able to distinguish among many other faces the face of their own father. As a result of the whole totality of the effect of this happening, at which time my poor wisdom tooth became a complete sacrifice, not only did my consciousness begin from that time on constantly absorbing in connection with everything the very essence of my deceased grandmother's behest, God bless her soul, but also in me at that time, because I did not go to a qualified dentist to have the cavity of this tooth of mine treated, which as a matter of fact I could not do because our home was too far away from any contemporary centre of culture. There began to ooze chronically from this cavity something which, as it was only recently explained to me by a very famous meteorologist with whom I chanced to become, as is said, bosom friends owing to frequent meetings in the Parisian night restaurants of Montmartre, had the property of arousing an interest in and a tendency to seek out the causes of the arising of every suspicious actual fact. And this property, not transmitted to my entirety by heredity, gradually and automatically led to my ultimately becoming a specialist in the investigation of every suspicious phenomenon which, as it is so often happened, came my way. This property newly formed in me after this event, when I, of course, with the cooperation of our all common master, the merciless Heropas, that is, the flow of time, was transformed into the young man already depicted by me, became for a real inextinguishable hearth, always burning, of consciousness. The second of the mentioned vivifying factors this time for the complete fusion of my dear grandmother's injunction with all the data constituting my general individuality was the totality of impressions received from information I chanced to inquire concerning the event which took place here among us on earth, showing the origin of that principle which, as it turned out according to the elucidations of Mr. Allan Kardec during an absolutely secret spiritualistic seance, subsequently became everywhere among beings similar to ourselves, arising and existing on all the other planets of the great universe, one of the chief life principles. The formulation in words of this new all-universal principle of living is as follows. If you go on a spree, then go the whole hog, including the postage. As this principle, now already universal, arose on that same planet on which you too arose, and on which, moreover, you exist almost always on a bed of roses, and frequently dance the foxtrot, I consider I have no right to withhold from you the information known to me, elucidating certain details of the arising of just that universal principle. Soon after the definite inculcation into my nature of the said new inherency, that is, the unaccountable striving to elucidate the real reasons for the arising of all sorts of actual facts, on my first arrival in the heart of Russia, the city of Moscow, where, finding nothing else for the satisfaction of my psychic needs, I occupied myself with the investigation of Russian legends, and saying I once happened, whether accidentally or as a result of some objective sequence according to a law I do not know, to learn by the way of the following. That is where I will finish, because once again, Gurdjieff begins a story there which flows on for a few more pages. So we're finishing that up there at page 36. I think that's probably what will happen quite a few times, because Gurdjieff tells quite a few tales which go on for many, many pages. So, yeah, I'm going to have a quick drink. If there's any immediate comments on that section, then please feel free. I just noticed there's a lot more people from last time, so thanks everyone for coming. It's it's very nice.
Can we speak about the tooth? Like the tooth with 7 roots and a drop of blood purling at the point of it.
Absolutely.
I don't even know what to make of it. So like, I'm glad to hear ideas. I'm like, is it symbolic? Is it just an anomaly? What is he meaning? What is he trying to say? And it's like spinning in my head. So I'm more than open to hearing suggestions.
Well, the first thing...
did have...
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no. So I read through that C.S. Knott's book, and he mentioned that Araj said, Beelzebub's tales, everything has 3 meanings and 7 acts. And I think
sorry, you cut out a little bit there. 3 meanings and...
3 meanings and 7 aspects.
Well, that would be... So there's 2 laws that Gurdjieff's always going on about. So I'll get up the picture of the Enneagram, which will... It's super important. It's super important for Gurdjieff. I mean, you know, I guess it's all tied together. So it's annoying because the Enneagram itself has been reused by other groups. So this is one which is sort of strict for Gurdjieff. So if you see on it 3, if you look at the points 3 to 6, then 6 to 9, then 9 to 3, there's a triangle. So that is the law of 3, and then the others are the law of 7 is also in there. So when he says there's 3 and then there's 7 aspects, it's about this law of 3. You have the law of 3 many times in Gurdjieff, so you'll notice there was many times he mentioned like 3 things in there. Or generally when thinking about the law of 3, it's like the first thing I tend to think of is here Gurdjieff's idea of a positive and negative. When you in life you have a positive and negative force. So you might in the individual mindset you might be sort of disciplined or pushed to do something, but you'll also have that negative force which is not telling you to do it. Gurdjieff introduces the extremely important thing, which is the neutralizing force, which is the force which takes both of these and neutralizes them into what the true will of that person wants to do. So you might, the positive force is like you sit down, you really want to meditate, and then the negative force is like, yeah, get up, you're bored, distracting force is just telling you not to do it. The neutralizing force is taking everything into account and remaining where it is you want to be. So that's one way of looking at that. So when we're looking at this tooth, my first thought would be that it's towards the law of 7, which is a completely separate thing to do with a musical scale. So do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do is what it's to do with. And in that scale, there are, for Gurdjieff, points where there's semitones. So you have tones and then semitones. So do, re are full tones, and then between mi and fa is a semitone. And Gurdjieff's point about this is that is where, say we're undertaking something in life, that is where extra effort, willed effort, has to be put in, because you don't have this complete tone, and that's where things can fall. So as for the actual metaphorical implications of what this tooth means, that is sort of beyond me at this moment. I'd be hastened to sort of just look that up, because it's so sort of, there's so much going on there with the tooth and the blood and the 7 as well. I mean, there's no element of that which is obviously accidental. But my first thought would be that it begins with that do re mi fa sol la si do. But yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for helping me connect the law of 7 to the musical scale, because that completely flew over my head when I read Ouspensky's book.
Mm-hmm.
Could we make anything out of him catching the ball with his thumb and forefinger, sort of like the magician card I'm thinking of? That's just a very specific image that, with the fingers that he described and everything, it made me think of it.
What's the... could you explain the magician card?
I could send a picture in the chat.
Okay. But I mean, my go-to thing with the ball and how he's catching things is, at first thought, it's just a way to get out of automatic habits. You're no longer aware of what's going on, really. The process is so automatic that you can even allow associative thoughts in, whereas if you said to yourself that you have to do something where you have to concentrate by the very difficult thing of thumb and forefinger, or with the food where he's like smelling it and getting himself to this absolute point of like enjoyment with the pastry, but then just gulps it down, you have to be attentive of that. It redirects your attention to the thing which isn't going to allow associative objects in. Oh no, I just stopped talking. I'm just looking at my notes from when I sort of. So there's quite a few really specific strange bits in this that I think are maybe key. So on page 20 he specifies that the Kurd is taking in air which hasn't been tampered by industrial towns. I think that's, for some reason, that really interested me, because air comes in as that first thing that we're digesting, and or even on a practical level, I wonder whether or not Gurdjieff had an understanding of whether or not, being in big cities and breathing in that kind of air, it's clearly, nowadays we do know via science that it is a detriment, but I wonder to what esoteric extent in Gurdjieff's theorizations what that sort of entails in us, because he constantly actually, he said, not constantly, he says a few times about basically people don't know how to breathe, and I always, but at the same time he says not to do breathing exercises without a teacher. So I always wondered what the in between was there, that perhaps we've fallen into an automatic breathing where, if we're more conscious of our breathing, what is that sort of allowing us? Another thing I would like to bring in is, why does he want us to reread this first chapter? It seems to me that the rereading is to basically solidify in us to not take the text seriously. He clearly wants us to take it seriously, but he also constantly wants us to take it with a pinch of salt, like so much salt that the book itself is basically, a salt bath. Like, he's asking us at all times, like, to be skeptical, and I think he's constantly pushing that, because he knows how easy it is to fall into that automatic habit of either automatic reading or just automatically accepting everything. And this first chapter, The Arousing of Thought, is him going over certain parables and certain ideas as to say, don't trust me, but why should you trust me? Right? I've never written before. This is a new form of writing. You've never seen my name before. Basically trying to get us to critique all those notions of why we would believe someone. Once again, that question of digestion comes up, which we brought up last time. He asked us to digest. The big question, I think, in this section is that, but I think he explains it very well, is that what one of the projects here is to do is to take what we consider to be real consciousness, which is what he would say is waking consciousness. So just to quickly explain it, for Gurdjieff, you have many different states of consciousness. The one that we're all in now, which we would consider waking consciousness, he actually considers that to be the one where we're asleep, right? Because you try focus or keep your attention on anything in this waking consciousness, actually you're constantly getting pulled apart and pulled back into sleep because you just constantly can't keep your focus. You can't keep your will on anything. And so when he's on about moving things in essence from the waking consciousness to that other consciousness, which he then just says is the subconsciousness, and in that sense the subconsciousness is more real, that I think is that way of, just for him, it's a very, very esoteric way of stating to be in the moment, but without that sort of new age tie-ins. He's sort of saying that if you just let life be, the essence of things will sink into you and you'll understand them more. Whereas when you're attending to things in your waking consciousness, thousands and thousands of associations are instantly coming in and dragging you back into sleep. So you never actually truly attend to the essence of what it is in front of you, or the essence of the object. You're never actually allowing that to go in you, and you're never, you have 1,000 associations on a certain thing, so you never really get to it. I've got a few more things written down, but those are just a few bits that I think we could just discuss in this group.
Tagging on to the breathing part, just before that he speaks about the bosom of nature and the Great Mother, and that is an image that also reappears later. And I have this idea that, okay, so is it getting away from the city, that it's, you're then closer to nature, while the city in itself is synthetic or man-made, but more of a perversion of nature? I'm just associating here. The bosom of nature and the mother, paired with the milk as something nurturing tied to digestion, also comes back when he takes the tooth to the barber with a friend. I can't remember exactly what it is. I'm just tossing it in.
Mm-hmm. Well, I bring in a little bit of biography on Gurdjieff, which I've read from basically all his students at La Prière, who said that when they went out driving with him in the French countryside, obviously this is in 30s and 40s in France, so nowhere near as obviously a lot of rural France is still fairly open, but back then I imagine far more was as you'd say, sort of wild. He constantly would just say he would be driving. He demanded that he drove everywhere, but he would just stop the car and get out. And many of these people, I think, understood why, but there's been reports of people who weren't actually students of his, who were just helping out around the house and needed to go somewhere, or family who weren't really doing his work. They never understood why, and I think to a certain degree that seems that he was almost doing that essence thing, was trying to just truly take in nature. And there's another really strange anecdote after his car crash, which almost killed him. He recovers in a week, where no human would really ever do that, and for the weeks following this, he just demands that all his students just cut down these trees at La Prière and burn them in front of him in a big fire. And there's in a few different accounts, they've all said that basically he'd made it clear that he was sort of trying to absorb the power of this thing that he's done in front of him. So he had to sort of abhor nature to be able to get this power. Now, it's interesting you bring in nature, because and I think Gurdjieff would certainly see much of the city as sort of this artificiality. But so one thing I just want to go back to, what was the page for the judgment seat above, and what was the left eye thing? Because I don't think it's anything to do with one thing, right, that Gurdjieff actually states, and many Gurdjieff members have stated, is that they were very, very reluctant to ever bring in other thinkers unless Gurdjieff had used them. Not because he didn't enjoy them. He enjoyed many thinkers, and he makes this clear in his life. But he's saying, look, here's my work. Don't, once again, by going, oh, this is like this is like this, you're entering into that associative debate, and it's like Gurdjieff is a very cheeky guy, as is evident. So yeah, sorry. The judgment one is which page? Sorry,
27.
27. And what was who was the left eye thing?
I don't know who brought up the left eye thing, but it's
I brought that up.
It's on page 22, regardless.
22. Okay.
Thank you.
Right. So, So for the purpose of avoiding any misunderstanding through this inherency, the data for which are formed in the entirety of contemporary man, thanks evidently to his frequenting of the cinema, and thanks also to his never missing an opportunity of looking into the left eye of the other sex. Well, that is obviously Apollonian and Dionysian, guys. So
Obviously.
Obviously. God, do you not know that? Yeah, this is one thing that frustrates me about reading groups. People take them like, I don't want them to be uptight. I want people to be, myself included, to be able to say, look, I don't know what this means. Like, let's dig into it. And it just, as soon as someone starts being like that, it's like, oh, God, man, it just puts you on edge. It makes you feel horrible. And it's, yeah. But I don't want to judge too much, So, the first thing I would point out is that, actually in private correspondence with someone who is, like, not trying to name drop, I will put this interview that I need to edit up, and I'll probably link it in here at some point. I managed to get in contact with one of the last living people. There's about 3, maybe 4 alive, who are old enough to know Gurdjieff. And this is this guy called Paul Beekman Taylor, who's written loads of books on Gurdjieff. I actually worked with him, and he's answered a few of my questions. And one of the things he said is that Gurdjieff loved the cinema. He loved it because you're watching people pretend to be other people, and in that sense you're watching someone else become someone. And he said the irony is that when actors change, when actors stop acting, they don't realize that they're immediately going back into another role. So there's one thing there of like, his frequenting the cinema would be an understanding of how people act, and that people are false personas, and that there's no such thing as like a non-personality. You're either acting, you're always acting. In Gurdjieff's language, it's actually called playing a role, right? A good example of this is, I imagine we all might have had to done, is like before an interview, all that stuff you like do before an interview, like what am I going to say this? How am I going to be? How am I going to smile? That's you preparing to play a role, but it's a role you need to play to get a certain thing or to do a certain thing. And Gurdjieff's basically saying that, after you leave that interview, what is the role that you're falling back to? And this is what cinema will show you. As for the left eye, I don't know. I actually don't know.
I thought the left eye, I looked it up, the left indicates sadness. If tears come from the left, it is sad, and if from the right, happiness. I did a quick search on that. I didn't know if there's any relation to that.
Sorry? So left is...
The left eye is usually indicating of sadness, and the right indicates a form of happiness when talking about tears or any sort of origin. But I'm not really sure. I forget the link, but that did come up.
Okay. I mean, left and... I don't think Gurdjieff actually agreed with the idea, but in sort of occult things and, things like that, left is left and right path, and left path is sort of the so to speak, more evil path. So it might be the more, to look into the left eye is to see the cunningness of the opposite sex.
I was more associated... sorry, continue.
Oh, no, that's all I was going to say, really.
Okay, when I asked the question, I have one association. I was once told that, like, the left eye is receptive and the right eye is, like, projective. This was said in, like, a Tantra hippie context, so I'm not drawing any gears on it. But that was one association. What I'm also curious about, and would kindly hear someone explain, is like this. Okay, so he thinks there's 2 consciousnesses, and one is mechanical and the other one is like formed by previous impressions. can someone help me clear this out? So those are like two options here.
I'm just gonna try find them because there is actually I think there's more. I think it's more than. I think there's. Here we go. I got it. So, yeah, I'm more aware of the idea of the first two because in the fourth way, there's actually 4 states of consciousness. So there's sleep, as in actual sleep, like go to bed, close your eyes, asleep. Then there's the waking state, so waking consciousness. Then there's self-awareness, and then there's objective consciousness. And I think the common language for these is like either type 1 or level 1. So 1, 2, 3, right? Sleep isn't actual sleep, as in snoring, isn't actually a state because you can't really do much with that. But equally, there is some interesting stuff that Gurdjieff says about actual sleep. So waking state, waking consciousness is the consciousness we are normally in, right? We're just like, you're walking down the street and you're thinking oh, that bird looks nice. As in bird in the air. Oh, what am I going to have for dinner? Oh, that car's red. Oh, I'd like that car. Oh, what's that cafe? Oh, what's that smell, right? Your mind is like, whether or not you realize it or not, you don't really have any free will because you're just constantly in, and that process itself is called sleep because it's basically the equivalent of actually being asleep because you're just in a dream, right? You're just letting your mind take you off wherever it wants, and that's what being awake is. It's being asleep. Now, then the next level is self-awareness, or this the next layer of consciousness is that, which for Gurdjieff I think is an understanding of the subconscious, because when you're attentive, you have an intuitive understanding of your surroundings, right? It's like when you're, and it's probably happened to many of us, that Gurdjieff says that actually everyone has times in their life when they truly do reach another level of consciousness, because you get a shock, right? In moments where many of us might have had an extreme, like, oh God, I'm in danger, all of a sudden, like they do it a lot in the movies, it's like the world suddenly sinks in and you're absolutely anchored to your reality and you're noticing so much more and you understand like instinctively how to get out or in of the situation or to do what needs to be done without sort of processing it. And I think that's why he's talking about subconscious, because on a subconscious level, you're suddenly attentive subconsciously of the world. And then very briefly, objective consciousness is like something almost sort of saint-like. That's probably the best I can do.
That's terrific. Is it Uspensky again who's written about these 4 stages of consciousness? It rings a bell, or is it earlier in the text?
Yeah, Uspensky writes about it quite early on, I think. Okay. Yeah. But yeah, I'm not too sure what to do about the recording now, really. Now that guy's...
Just edit it.
It's just a massive blank, yeah.
It's interesting about the actor in Gurdjieff's work. I mean, does he have a huge following in LA? Just to be a silly question.
I don't know. It might do. So I mean, the big groups in America at the time were New York, and I think there was. I'm not sure if there was actors who came to him. I know there was a lot of writers who sort of were drawn to him. But I don't actually know. I don't know if there's any reference to what films he truly enjoyed. Yeah.
A general question about data. Did we discuss the first in forms of data and then the vivifying versions of the second and third? I wasn't really quite sure what we meant by that.
The vivifying sources is something that sort of eluded me, because it's one of the points where like he starts talking about one and it's like 10 pages until he suddenly goes, oh, and the second one, and you're like, wait, what? So I don't know, does anyone else have any comments on the vivifying sources?
I general question about data. Did we discuss the first in forms of data and then the vivifying versions of the second and third? I wasn't really quite sure what we meant by that.
Like I might be completely off, but I sort of had the impression that it could be these like poignant memories of his. So like his grandmother's passing being like the main primary one, and then he recalls like getting into that fight, and I thought that was maybe like a second one or third one. I could be totally off, but that was like sort of something that I was thinking about.
Yeah, I mean they definitely directly connected to those two events. So you're probably, as it were, for the feeding and perfecting of this first datum. So the first datum arose when he was a chubby, as he says, a chubby mite. And that first one is his lesson from his grandma. I think you're probably completely correct. So I guess in terms of, once again, Gurdjieff using very, very specific language, considering he didn't, speak English, and this would have been specifically translated, vivifying, the definition is make more lively or enliven. So I guess in that sense, we can understand it as making one's life more of a life. And in terms of a source, I guess, those two, as Holly stated, those two things run with him throughout his life. Yeah.
What was the third one though? Was there like an? I'm trying to remember if that was, or if anyone has an idea.
Have we gotten that far yet?
I think we did. I think it's like loosely mentioned.
I don't know. After doing that third reading, I feel like I got a lot more out of that first 16 pages.
Okay. Yeah. So there's okay. I found a little site which is, so the first one is, in life never do as others do, either do nothing or do something nobody else does. The second is the wisdom tooth. Comes out, and the cavity left behind oozes a substance that produces the property of. So the second one, in short, is always seeking out the causes of suspicious actual fact. So that tooth, it seems to be an allegory for what was the cause, and it was because I don't think he'd looked after his tooth right. So he's going back to the root. And then 3, if you go on a spree, then go the whole hog, including the postage, which is this one comes up more often than not in the stuff I've read. So he shortens that in the end to, if you take, then take. So he's just like, no, he really, I don't think, in terms of polite Western society, he wouldn't have been considered polite, because he was very much, he'd obviously say please and thanks, but he's very much like, in the West, we have this like, propensity to be like overly polite, because we sort of understand that will help us to get our thing, where it's like, no, if you're going to take, then take. Like, don't lie in that sort of passive way of like, oh, thank you so much, well, that would be lovely. Like, no, take. If you go on a spree, then go the whole hog, including the postage. Like, don't dip your toe, kind of thing. So those are the 3, I think, from this very bare bones website that I'm on.
Yeah, and I guess each corresponds to like that sort of like saying of some kind. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay.
But I must admit, the tooth is still like, there's more there, and it's just, it can't just be like, I don't know. So I guess the fact the tooth had to come out was because that it had been left to rot, and it was a suspicious tooth because it had 7 ends or whatever. But then the point of it is always seek out the cause of suspicious actual fact. So I guess maybe that's very simply just him saying, like, if something seems too magical or too good to be true, like, no, seek backwards, and that's how you discern whether or not something is, a true miracle or whatever.
I don't know if everyone else is pairing, because in the beginning he says the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, and every time he does a 3, I sort of try to match those sort of things to those 3 pillars. And when he says like 7 rays of white light, like I'm trying to think of where in Christianity there are 7 rays or 7 days, or like what is the play that he's trying to communicate? Is there any relationship? I don't know, but I do this.
Is there 7 angels at one point in the?
There may be. I don't know.
7 archangels, I think, maybe.
There are 7 angels in the book of Revelation.
that might be your answer. But there's also another time where, so you mentioned that he's using 3, and actually you have this like one, obviously first the books are in 3 series, and then there's 3 aims to the series, and then also he says obviously to read it 3 ways. So for the welfare and peace of the souls of your parents. Secondly, for the welfare of one's neighbour, and then thirdly, for yourself. So it's only yourself is the last thing. And actually then he says, so those are this is in the friendly advice section right at the beginning. It says, any prayer may be heard by the higher powers, and a corresponding answer obtained only if it is uttered thrice. So this whole thing of 3, and then I sort of mapped these because then it says like, you read it first mechanically, and it's like if you map them against the other ones, you have to do it in reverse. So like the second one is to read aloud to another person, which I had sort of mapped to the welfare of one's neighbours, right? You'd read to your neighbours. So then the first time you read it mechanically is just for yourself. Then the second time when you read it aloud is for your neighbours. And when you finally fathom the gist, that is for the peace and soul of your parents. That was sort of what I made of that. But there's this constant, it could be pages and pages written on the constant use of like 3 separate things.
Yeah, fair enough.
But yeah, has anyone else got any little bits they want to add in, or talk about?
Do you look for 3s and 7s, or just the 7s? Because
well, I don't know if it's a good thing to like just go through looking for 3s and 7s.
I know. That's what I'm.
They're angel
kind of
numbers.
like. Yeah.
But the 3 is generally just in. So in terms of that Enneagram symbol, the law of 3 is in relation to the individual, and the law of 7 is in relation to the way the cosmos is working. So that is how I would see them. So and then when in the Enneagram, the law of 3, which is the individual, which is us, is amongst the 7. So do re mi sol la fa si do, whatever it is. I'm not musically inclined. So yeah, but we're like amongst that. So when you look at the Enneagram, it's like if you go from 1 to 3, you realize like that's the first part of the triangle. So it's like do re mi, and that's also where the first semitone is, which is how the Enneagram is constructed. And then obviously that's where you have to put in some effort to be able to get through to that next bit and that next bit. And then obviously when you map, sorry, not obviously, I don't want to sound like the other guy, but 3, 6, and 9, when you map that with the equilibrium of emotion, physicality, emotion, intuition, and intellect, that is when you sort of realize that effort has to be made at each step to equalize them, and then you've made that sort of like almost full rotation where you've come to the end, and in that sense sort of truly understood something. You haven't just halted at an emotional level or an intellectual level, like, oh, I've got it. It's like, intellectualize your emotions and emotionalize your intellect, because you'll begin to see things about yourself, basically.
And the semitones are shocks? Are those the shocks?
That is when you need a shock. Yeah. That's like the point where something has to come in and be like, I mean, in a very simple sense, it could be like you're literally in the gym and you've got 7 sets, and on that, between the, what would it be, the 3rd and the 4th set, you need someone to come along and be like, no, come on, keep going. Like, I wonder how well it would map against real life things like that, in terms of if you could measure, someone's sort of propensity to work. But who knows? But that's sort of how I see it. It's like, well, the shock isn't how I see it. That is that you need the shock at that point. Yeah.
Okay.
Could someone maybe please remind me the line we stopped reading at? Because there was something which was sort of interesting that I maybe wanted to bring up, but I think I accidentally read ahead it slightly. Because we ended on page 36, right? Mm-hmm. And then if you go on a spree, then go the whole hog, including the posters. Was that where we stopped?
We finished at to learn by the way the following. So it's like I occupied myself with the investigation of Russian legends and sayings. So then it finishes with a colon, and then it's going to open into the Once Upon a Time, a Certain Russian.
Oh, okay. I think my translation is like slightly different.
Really?
But
what does yours say?
I think. Which line are you on again?
I'm on
On this
36
page.
on Once Upon a Time, a Certain Russian. Who?
Okay. Yeah, I think it's a bit different, but I won't distract the discussion over this. But I think I read ahead slightly. But yeah.
No, what did you want to ask? Because I don't. There's no problem with reading ahead because it's all going to go back and forward, isn't it?
So, but I think we haven't read this part yet. But okay, so after like if you go on a spree, then go the whole hog, including the postage, and then it says, I don't know. It's my page is a bit different, so I'm gonna have to look into that. I think I don't see the introduction to the story that you just read, so I'm gonna have to figure that out. Okay. Thank you, though.
But what was the thing you sort of wanted to add?
So on my page 36, there's a section which says, at the same time, in the whole region of my spine, there began an intense, almost unbearable itching, and in the very center of my solar plexus, an equally uncomfortable colic. And after a while, these two mutually stimulating sensations gave way to suddenly a peaceful inner state. And then he kind of goes on and on. But I thought that he was maybe perhaps referencing something like a Kundalini type experience, and I was wondering what people thought about that. But I think I may be a bit ahead.
I did just look, and that's on page 30, like just at the very bottom of page 37 on my translation, at least. So.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. That's there. Okay, I can see it now. I think this is in direct relation to Kundalini, which he didn't advise against. I think he did teach. He personally taught many of his followers it, but he's like really cautious to teach breathing exercises which aren't taught by like a specific tutor. But I think it's definitely in relation to Kundalini, and he also practiced himself. Is it Hatha yoga or Hatha?
I think maybe Hatha yoga.
Hatha. Okay. Hatha yoga. Yeah.
I think Hatha.
Yeah. Hatha yoga.
Okay. Yeah. So that's also what he practiced himself. So, yeah. And the first exercise you're given is a very simple sensing exercise, which is, it's called the daily preparation, which is you sit for about 10-15 minutes and you just focus on the sensation in like one limb below your head. And then eventually, once you've done that a bit, you focus on your whole body for 15 minutes. So I think there is a sense, the way that was explained to me is that the guy that I spoke to about this said all these big philosophers want to like theorize the whole world and the universe, but they don't want to remember their feet. And it's really important for Gurdjieff, like in that story of the horse, the carriage, and the rider. When you think about it, you're like, well, what's the carriage? It just seems to be dragged along or told what to do. But it's important, I think, to remember that the carriage is the thing. It's the anchor to the world. It's literally connected to the world, and the importance of the energy in the body for Gurdjieff is basically just that. It's like, remember you have a body. That's your anchor to the world. Don't sort of let yourself float off into another world. Like, this is almost like your vessel. And the more you focus on that, the more you're drawn into an attentive reality and you understand your body. Whether or not that's what the unbearable itch is, I don't know.
Okay, thank you. Maybe it'll we'll go into it more in the next section.
Yeah, I'm sure it's weird. I must have just an extra little section. I know it's just the book's been edited a few little times but there shouldn't be too much taken out. So it might be just like an extra page or something. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, I think this is probably a good place to finish up. I mean, I'm not keeping these to a certain time, but it's been going quite a while. So unless there's anything anyone else wants to add, then maybe that's a good place to finish up.
Just while I'm thinking of it, since we were talking about the feet thing, on page 23, he also mentions the English sole, specifically being that sole and then also the sole of your foot are spelled the same. Just thought that was interesting.
So when he says English sole, he uses the spelling of the foot.
Well, he brings up that it works for both. He says, the point is that in this fashionable language, the words sole and the bottom of your foot, also called sole, are pronounced and even written almost alike.
And it sounds like a super banal thing to state, but the sole of your foot is your, quite literally, your anchor to the world. And in fact, I think it's Madame de Salzman who says that when you read Beelzebub Tales, read it intellectually and emotionally, and then obviously everyone's thinking like, I think I said this last time, how do you incorporate the body? It's like, try focus on the feeling of your feet on the floor while you're listening to it or reading it, and that's like the way to have it all at once. And your feet being on the floor is like, I think Gurdjieff always wants to make it clear, it's like, it's not, that's why I was really against what that guy was saying about bringing in all this black magic, and it's like, it's not that. It's really not that at all. Anything like that, it's like, well, no, it's just being in your body and being in reality and sensing the world. There's no like rituals or anything like that.
Isn't the soul also where Peter Pan sews on his shadow which has escaped? Am I remembering the movie correctly? Let's not go into that sidetrack. Sorry.
I mean, if you wanted to look into like fiction and Gurdjieff, you probably want to read Mary Poppins. The author of Mary Poppins, P.L. Travers, was a Gurdjieffian, and Mary Poppins is clearly like, as soon as I figured that, I was like, okay, Mary Poppins is clearly like a female articulation of Gurdjieff.
Thank you. That's valuable information.
But yeah, thanks for coming, guys. Sorry for the awkwardness for the 20 minutes or so, but thanks for coming. Any questions or any whatever, feel free to message me or put it in the Gurdjieff Work little chat. But thanks for coming. This is going really well, I think. And see you all next week.
Thank you, James.
Thank you. This was great.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.